Reached across the kitchen table and picked up my late husband's watch. Not to look at it, not to admire it, just to move it out of his way so he could set down his coffee mug. I watched him do it. I watched him pick up the watch my husband of 41 years had worn every single day, the one I had polished and kept on that table because it made the kitchen feel less empty, and I watched my son-in-law place it on the counter behind him without so much as glancing at it twice. And I said nothing. That moment wasn't the worst thing he did in the 2.5 years he lived in my house, not even close. But it was the first time I felt something shift inside me, something quiet, something that had been patient for a very long time and was beginning, slowly, to run out of patience. My name is Nadine. I worked as a pharmacy technician on Anima's My Adult Life, in the house my husband and I bought in 1989, the year our daughter was born. The magnolia tree in the front yard was a sapling then. Now it shades the entire porch. I want to tell you what happened in that house. I want to tell you because I spent a long time being ashamed of it, and then I spent a long time being angry about it, and now I am on the other side of both of those things. And the view from here is clearer than I expected. My husband passed in the spring of 2021. Pancreatic cancer. From diagnosis to the end was 11 weeks. I tell people that because the speed of it still stuns me even now. 11 weeks is not enough time to say everything you need to say. It is not enough time to prepare. You just hold on as long as you can, and then one morning you wake up and the other side of the bed is cold, and it stays cold, and you understand, slowly, that this is your life now. My daughter Renee flew in from Phoenix for the funeral. She had been living out there for 4 years with her husband, a man named Keith, who worked in logistics and had very firm opinions about everything from the best route to take on the highway to the correct way to load a dishwasher. I had known Keith for 6 years by then. We had always been polite to each other. That is the most honest way I can put it. Renee cried at the funeral the way you cry when someone has been the center of your whole life. Her father had walked her down the aisle. He had driven 12 hours to Phoenix when she had her appendix out. He had called her every Sunday at 10 in the morning without fail, right up until he couldn't anymore. She was his whole heart, and she knew it. After the service, she sat with me at the kitchen table and held my hand and said, "Mama, I don't want to leave you here alone." I told her I would be fine. I believed that when I said it. She went back to Phoenix. She called every few days. The house was very quiet. About 4 months later, Renee called on a Tuesday evening and told me that Keith's company had downsized. He had been laid off. They had been living in a rented apartment, and with his income gone, they were not sure they could cover next month's rent. She didn't ask directly. She talked around it the way you do when you're embarrassed to need something. I listened to her not asking, and I said, "Come stay with me. Stay as long as you need." There was a pause, and then she said, "Are you sure, Mama?" I was sure. I was lonely. The magnolia tree was losing its leaves, and the house had too many rooms, and I missed having people in it. I told her to come. They arrived on a Friday with a rented truck and 3 trips worth of boxes. I had cleared out the guest room, put fresh linens on the bed, made space in the hall closet. Keith shook my hand at the door and said, "We really appreciate this, Nora." He said it the way you say something you have rehearsed. The first few weeks were all right. Renee cooked dinner twice a week and we watched television together in the evenings. Keith was mostly quiet. He applied for jobs. He watched sports in the living room, and I read in my bedroom, and we stayed out of each other's way without making it feel deliberate. I did not ask them for rent. They had no income. I covered the groceries, the utilities, all of it. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself family takes care of family. My husband would have done the same thing. The changes were gradual. That's the thing I want you to understand. It wasn't one big moment at the beginning. It was small things, one after another, each one so minor that it felt petty to mention it. Keith started keeping beer in the refrigerator on the shelf where I kept my orange juice. I moved my orange juice. He rearranged the living room furniture because, he said, the couch was better positioned for the television on the other wall. I came home from my garden club meeting one afternoon, and the couch was facing a different direction, and the armchair I always sat in had been moved to the corner near the window where the light was worse for reading. I moved the armchair back. 2 days later, it was in the corner again. He had a friend over one Saturday, a man I had never met, and they sat in my living room until after midnight, watching a game with the volume high enough that I could hear it through my bedroom door. I got up twice and lowered the volume on my way to the bathroom. By the time I gave up and put in my earplugs, it was nearly 1 in the morning. I mentioned it to Renee the next day, gently. I said I had trouble sleeping. She said, "Keith doesn't have many friends out here, Mama. He was just trying to have a normal night." She said it like that was the end of the conversation. Maybe she believed it was. Keith got a job in February. A decent one, project coordinator at a shipping firm downtown. I thought things would change. I thought now that there was money coming in, they would start talking about finding their own place. I waited. February became March. March became summer. They were still there. When I suggested very carefully that it might be time to think about next steps, Renee said they were saving up. Keith said the rental market in Savannah was brutal right now. I nodded and I let it go, and I added another month to the tally I was keeping in the back of my mind. The watch incident was in the fall of that year. September, I think. The leaves on the oak out back had just started to turn. 2 weeks after that, Keith said something that I have thought about nearly every day since. I was in the living room, in my armchair, reading. It was a Sunday afternoon. He came in from somewhere, I don't know where, and stood in the middle of the room and looked around the way people do when they're assessing a space, like they're trying to figure out what could be different. He said, "You know, if we moved that bookshelf, we could fit a proper sectional in here." I put my book down. I looked at him. I said, "This is my bookshelf. It belonged to my mother." He said, "I know. I'm just saying, as a use of space, it's not very efficient." I said, "I'm not interested in efficient." He looked at me for a moment with an expression I had not seen from him before. Not anger exactly, something closer to impatience, like I was being unreasonable. He said, "It's just a suggestion, Nora. You don't have to get defensive about it." And then he left the room. I sat there with my book open in my lap, and I did not read a single word for a very long time. I kept thinking about the word defensive. I kept thinking about who was allowed to be defensive in a house they had owned for 34 years. That night I did not sleep well. Renee was working remotely, editing content for a marketing company. She worked in the second bedroom they'd turned into an office, and she was in there most of the day. We had less time together than I had imagined when they first moved in. I had thought us being under the same roof would mean more of her. It meant less in some ways. She was busy. Keith filled the common spaces. He started making comments about my spending. I had hired a woman named Gloria to come clean the house every 2 weeks, same as I had done for 12 years. Keith mentioned once, then twice, that it was an unnecessary expense when there were perfectly capable adults in the house. I looked at him when he said it, and I thought, "You are a guest in my home, and you are telling me how to spend my money." I thought it clearly. I did not say it. I should have said it. I had a routine with my neighbor, a woman I've known since Renee was in middle school. Every Wednesday morning we walked 2 miles through the neighborhood and then sat on her porch and had coffee. It was one of the things that kept me steady after my husband passed. One Wednesday I came home from that walk to find Keith in the kitchen on a phone call, pacing, and my coffee maker had been moved to the counter on the other side of the sink because, he told me later, he needed the counter space for his laptop while he worked. My coffee maker. The one my husband bought me for a 35th anniversary. I moved it back. He moved it again 2 days later. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from living in your own home and fighting, quietly, for every inch of it. It doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. You go to bed tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix, and you wake up braced for the next small thing, and the bracing itself takes something out of you. It was a Thursday in November when it happened, the moment I cannot unhear. I was sitting in my armchair. I had made myself a cup of tea, the good chamomile I keep in the cabinet above the stove. The evening news was on. I had the volume where I like it, which is a little louder than most people prefer because I have some hearing loss in my left ear, and I've stopped being embarrassed about it. Keith came in from the kitchen. He stood in front of the television. He said, "Can you turn that down? I'm trying to take a call in the next room." I said, "I'll try to keep it moderate." He said, "I need you to turn it down now, and actually, I've got someone coming over in about an hour. I need the living room." I said, "This is my living room." He looked at me the way you look at someone who is being slow to understand something obvious. He said, "I'm not trying to fight with you, Nora. I just need the space for a couple of hours. You can watch TV in your room." Your room. He said it like that was a fair division. Like I had a room, and he had the rest. I looked at him for a moment. He was standing in front of my television, between me and the evening news, in the house where I had raised my daughter, in the room where my husband used to fall asleep in the armchair on Sunday afternoons with the newspaper across his chest. I looked at all of that and I said nothing. I turned off the television. I stood up, I picked up my tea, and I walked out the front door. Not out of my life, just out of the house. I needed air. I needed to stand somewhere that didn't feel contested. I sat on the porch for a while until the cold got to my knees, and then I got in my car and I drove. I didn't have a destination. I ended up at a Cracker Barrel about 20 minutes away, which sounds almost funny now, but at the time it was simply a place with lights on and people in it and food that tasted like something my mother used to make. I ordered chicken and dumplings, and I sat in a booth by myself, and I thought about the watch on the counter. I thought about the armchair in the corner. I thought about the word defensive and the word your room. I thought about the coffee maker and the bookshelf and the 28 months I had been keeping a quiet, patient tally. I thought about my husband. I thought about what he would have said. He was a gentleman, my husband, a deacon at our church for 20 years. He did not believe in confrontation for its own sake, but he had a line, and when someone crossed it, he had a way of going very still and very calm and saying exactly what needed to be said, with no extra words. He used to call it getting clear. Sitting in that booth, I got clear. I paid my bill. I drove home. The house was lit up and I could hear voices inside. I did not go in. I sat in my car in the driveway and I called my friend Harriet's daughter, who is an attorney in Savannah, and I left her a message asking if she had time to meet that week. Then I went inside, said goodnight to no one in particular, and went to bed. I met with the attorney on a Monday morning. Her name is Josephine. She has her mother's eyes and her mother's directness, and within about 10 minutes of me explaining the situation, she said, "Nora, what you're describing is your legal right as a homeowner. Let me explain what your options are." She explained them clearly. Because Keith and Renee had been living in my home without a formal lease for over a year, they had established a month-to-month tenancy under Georgia law, which meant I could not simply ask them to leave by Friday. I had to give them proper written notice. 60 days, given the length of their stay. I said, 60 days. She said, 60 days, but it's legally binding, and if they do not leave by that date, you have the right to begin formal eviction proceedings. I had not used the word eviction in my mind before that morning. It felt like a harsh word. It felt like something that happened to strangers in bad circumstances, not to your own daughter and her husband in your own kitchen. But I thought about the coffee maker. I thought about your room. I thought about the watch. I said, let's prepare the notice. Josephine drafted it. It was formal and clear and exactly the right length. It stated that the occupants were required to vacate the premises within 60 days of the date of delivery, and that failure to do so would result in legal action. I did not deliver it myself. Josephine arranged for a process server. I had thought hard about that. Part of me wanted to walk in and hand it to Keith myself, to see his face, but I knew if I did that, it would become a scene. It would become shouting. It would pull Renee into the middle in a way that might break something between us that I did not want broken. A process server removes the theater from it. It makes it a legal matter, not a personal one. The process server arrived on a Wednesday morning while I was at my walk with my neighbor. I had planned it that way. I got the call when I was sitting on her porch having coffee. The notice had been served. I held the phone for a moment, and then I set it face down on the table, and I picked up my coffee, and I said, "How's your sister doing? You mentioned she'd had a rough month." And we talked about her sister for the next 40 minutes. Renee called me that afternoon. I was in the garden, cutting back the rose bushes before winter. She said, "Mama, what did you do?" I said, "I gave you official notice of what I need, the way the law requires." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You could have just talked to me." I thought about that. I thought about all the times I had tried to talk to her. The comment about Gloria, the armchair, the thing she had said about Keith not having many friends. I thought about 28 months of trying to talk to her in small ways, in gentle ways, in ways that she had absorbed and then redirected, until I had learned to stop trying. I said, "Renee, I am asking you to think back over the past 2 years, and I am asking you to be honest with yourself about whether talking has been working." She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Keith is going to be furious." I said, "I know." She said, "Where are we supposed to go?" I said, "You have 60 days and 2 incomes. I believe in you." There was another silence, longer this time. And then something shifted in it, very slightly, the way a room feels different when someone opens a window. She said quietly, "He's gotten worse, hasn't he? You're not just doing this because of the notice." I said, "No, I'm not." She said, "I'm sorry, Mama. I should have." She stopped, started again. "I should have seen it better." I said, "I know you should have. I'm not ready to talk about all of it yet, but I will be." Keith did not take it quietly. He came to find me that evening in the kitchen where I was making my dinner, and he stood in the doorway, and he was very controlled in the way that angry people sometimes are when they know they can't afford to lose their temper. He said, "This is not how family handles things." I turned from the stove and I looked at him. I said, "You're right. It's not. This is how homeowners handle it when the situation has gone on long enough." He said, "We've been paying your utilities. We've been contributing." I said, "You've been paying your share of what you use. That's not the same thing as contributing to someone else's home." He said, "You're really going to do this?" I said, "I already did." He stood there for another moment. I turned back to the stove. After a while, I heard him walk away. He didn't speak to me much after that, which was, honestly, a relief. They were out in 53 days. Renee had found them an apartment in Midtown, a 2-bedroom on the 4th floor with a balcony she sent me a photo of. She texted me the morning they loaded the truck. She said, "We'll be out by noon. I love you, Mama. I'm sorry it got to this point." I texted back, "I love you too. Call me when you're settled." I stood on the porch and watched them drive away. Keith didn't look back. Renee turned and raised her hand through the passenger window. I raised mine. Then I went back inside. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been for a long time. Not the heavy quiet of grief that I had lived in after my husband passed. A different quiet. Lighter, somehow. like a room after you've opened all the windows and let the old air out. I walked into the living room. I moved my armchair back to where it belonged, in front of the window with the afternoon light. I went to the kitchen and I moved my coffee maker back to its spot on the left side of the counter, next to the window above the sink where I like to stand in the mornings and watch the birds come to the feeder in the yard. I picked up my husband's watch from the windowsill where I had moved it months ago for safekeeping, and I put it back on the kitchen table. Then I sat down in my armchair and I turned on the evening news with the volume exactly where I like it. I had not realized until that moment how long I had been making myself smaller in my own home, not all at once, bit by bit, accommodation by accommodation, until I was living in the margins of my own life and calling it keeping the peace. Renee called the following Sunday. We talked for a long time about her father, about the years she had lived with us before she moved to Phoenix, about Keith, and some things she admitted she had looked away from because it was easier than looking directly at them. It was not an easy conversation, but it was an honest one, and honest ones are the only kind worth having. She asked if she could come visit for Thanksgiving. I said yes. I said she could come alone if she needed some time, or she could bring Keith if they were in a better place by then, but that if she brought Keith, I would need to see something different from him. I did not spell out exactly what I meant. She understood. She came for Thanksgiving. She came alone. We cooked together in the kitchen. She made the cornbread the way I taught her, with real buttermilk in a cast-iron skillet. I made the sweet potato pie my mother used to make every year without a written recipe, just memory and taste. We ate at the table where my husband's watch sat in its place, and we talked about him, and we laughed a few times at things he used to say, and the house felt like itself again. After dinner, we sat on the porch with decaf, even though it was cold, because the magnolia tree at night is something worth seeing, and she said, "Mama, I didn't know how unhappy you were." I said, "I didn't let you see it." She said, "You should have." I said, "You're right. We both should have done some things differently." She leaned her head on my shoulder the way she used to when she was small. I put my arm around her. The street was quiet. The tree was bare now, waiting for spring. The porch light threw a warm circle out onto the front walk. I tell the story because I spent a long time thinking that what I should have done was said something sooner, pushed back harder, been less accommodating, less patient, less willing to move my armchair and my coffee maker and my orange juice and my whole sense of what was mine. And maybe that's part of it. Boundaries matter. Setting them early matters. I know that now in my bones in a way I did not know it before. But I also want to say this. To anyone who has ever found themselves in a house that slowly stopped feeling like their own, you are allowed to reclaim it. Quietly, legally, without a single raised voice if that's how you need to do it. You do not have to justify the decision to the person who pushed you to it. You do not owe a scene to anyone. You just have to get clear about what belongs to you and then act accordingly. My husband's watch is on the kitchen table. My coffee maker is by the window. My armchair is in the light. I am home. I think about the watch a lot. Not the legal notice, not the process server, not even the moment I walked out the front door with my tea still warm in my hand. The watch. The way Keith picked it up without looking at it and set it aside like it was a coaster. That was the moment I should have understood what the next 2 years were going to look like. But I wasn't ready to see it yet. There's something I've learned about the way certain situations unfold. They don't arrive all at once. They come in small installments, each one just minor enough that you can talk yourself out of reacting, until one day you add them all up and realize the total is staggering. Keith didn't walk into my house and declare it his on day one. He moved a coffee maker. He rearranged a couch. He used a word like defensive when I was the one sitting in my own armchair. And I let each of those things pass because I was trying to be gracious, because I loved my daughter, because my husband had just died, and I didn't have the energy to fight for furniture. That's how it works. Not with a single act of cruelty, but with 100 small surrenders you didn't realize you were making. What I know now is that kindness without limits isn't really kindness. It's a door left open that the wrong person will eventually walk through and redecorate. I opened that door out of love for Renee, and I kept it open out of habit and grief and a deep reluctance to cause any more pain in a year that had already had too much of it. That was the part of me that needed to grow. Not tougher, exactly. Clearer. Clearer about what I was willing to give and what was never mine to give away in the first place. The decision to call Josephine wasn't made in anger. It was made in a Cracker Barrel booth at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night, eating chicken and dumplings alone, thinking about my husband's watch on a stranger's counter. It came from something quieter than anger. It came from the part of me that finally understood that protecting my home was not an act of selfishness. It was an act of self-respect, which is something nobody can hand you. You have to decide it for yourself, usually in the least dramatic moment possible. Usually when you're very tired and a little bit cold and all you wanted was to watch the evening news in peace. The 60 days passed. Renee came for Thanksgiving. We made cornbread and sweet potato pie, and we talked about her father and we laughed at things he used to say. That healing didn't happen because I was passive. It happened because I was honest. Because I was willing to hold a hard line and also willing to hold my daughter's hand on the other side of it. Those two things are not opposites. Knowing when to stand firm and knowing when to reach out. That's not a contradiction. That's just what it looks like to love someone and still insist on being whole. My armchair is by the window now. The light is exactly right for reading. I think my husband would approve.